Over the last couple months, Ukraine started to be very significant in the news cycle. How should Christians think about that? Welcome to The Conquering Truth. I'm Dan Horn.
I'm Jonathan Sides.
I'm Charles Churchill.
And I'm Joshua Horn.
Ever since Russia took over the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine in 2014, there's been various levels of troops on the border between Russia and Ukraine. And now all of a sudden it becomes a very significant story. It's on the front pages. People are talking about it. The president's been talking about it. So why is that, and should it be that way?
I mean, and it's interesting because, if you look at it just as a casual observer, there are obviously reasons I could come up with and say, Joe Biden's numbers in the polls are really bad. It's never a bad thing to have a war that usually increases your numbers, have some sort of conflict, to have something where you can come in and be heroic and contrast with your behavior in Afghanistan and what happened there. And, you can think of political reasons, but when you start actually looking for real details, and you start actually going and looking and saying, why is this actually happening? And what are real concrete things that would tell me? There's actually not a lot of concrete information that's coming out that you can point to in the government. It's just a lot of statements by the government that things are going on, and there's other people saying things that are kind of the opposite and saying things that would make it sound like that's not what's really happening. And there's not a lot of concrete data out there that really would tell a person exactly, is this happening? Is it really what's happening now? Are you, and how should you think about it, and what should our role in it be? Because all the means of thinking about it are kind of absent.
But they've been in this situation for, 8 years now, where Russia builds up troops and then they've brought them away and they haven't taken over again. They haven't done anything. It's really easy to sit back and hear these things and think you know what's going on. And the reality is, we don't have much idea of what's going on there.
I mean, it'd also be possible to argue it the other way. The media is, constantly concerned about nothing stories. This minor celebrity used this racial slur decades ago, but for 8 years, one of the world's biggest nations is, threatening to invade another large nation. I mean, there's the other way to look at it, which is, why aren't people more concerned about this? And I'm not saying they should be, but there are two sides to the issue of coverage.
So you're saying there's kind of two ways you could be reading it. One is just, hey, this has always been a big story. Why do we care about it now? Or is this really a big story? Why are we caring about it now?
And it may even be worth saying one of the reasons why we're trying to do this episode tonight is I'm 47 years old. I grew up and watched, we had the Gulf War, we had the Second Gulf War. My father's generation grew up and they had the Korean War and they had the Vietnam War. And most of these things, they really get studied in retrospect. At the time, it's just these series of events that happen and everybody's kind of pulled through them. And afterwards, people look back and they go, were our justifications for doing this right? Was the right, And we have this history of these things happening. It's not like the Ukrainian thing going on is like, oh, I can't believe this has happened in the world. It's like, well, it's been a few years since we've had a major invasion of anything. So it's about time to do another one. And there's this part of it where, kind of what we're asking tonight isn't just about Ukraine, but there's kind of the subtext of, is there a way as you go through it to not get sucked up into the narrative and be able to think about it and actually be analytical and be reasoning about it and to think about this in a Christian way? And if more people did this, would this change what the nation did and how the nation was? And so, so Ukraine's very relevant, not like Ukraine's unimportant, but in the end, the point of it is really to go, how do you stop being completely manipulated all the time and just always look at history as this thing of, well, now that we can look back, we can see that we were manipulated here and here and here. And can you go, we're being manipulated now.
Right. And I think, even when we talk about how, Russia is a major power, really? The GDP of Germany is more than twice that of Russia. Really, if you have a war between, and granted, Russia has nuclear weapons, which does shift the power, but so does the U.S., and the U.S. is going to come in on the side of Germany. But if you look, it's not like Russia could actually even come close to invading Europe. It just doesn't have the resources to do it. It's an incredibly poor country.
Right.
And they pretend like they can, but the reality is they've been poor for a long time, and they put up this, I remember, I'm old. I remember back with Reagan and Russia was putting on this, we're so fierce and we can defeat everybody. And he went, no, you can't. And they just collapsed. I mean,
they were a paper tiger. They were literally.
They do not have the financial resources. They have half the financial resources of one country in Europe. I mean, that's significant.
Right,
and so if they did it, you could see them going into Ukraine. But the idea of them invading into Europe is pretty ridiculous at this point.
And I think that's the issue. It's definitely a big deal in Ukraine. It's a huge deal in Ukraine. What's going on, and it's been a huge deal for a long time. I mean, it's a big threat to Ukraine. The fact that their neighbor that is more powerful than them, is interested in taking at least part of their land. And, the country itself is not all that unified either. I mean, it's a big deal in Ukraine.
It's a big deal to the Ukrainian government.
And the people.
I know.
Sure?
I meant like in the sense of a huge deal. There are some people there who it's not that big of a deal with. You know what I mean?
I think there's a large people there that don't really care that much. And then there's some that would very much like Russia to come in. And then there's some, especially the government, but other people too,
sure,
that would be very opposed to it. So at the American Revolution, there were clearly three groups of people. There were the people that were the patriots that were fighting. There were the people that were supporting England and did not want to fight. And there were a lot of people that just didn't want to deal with it. They just wanted to go about their lives. And if you look like at a country like Ukraine, we should expect the same thing. We always want to pretend like it's not like that, but the reality is there are lots of people there that speak Russian. They probably wouldn't be that unhappy if the Russians came in. There's lots of people there that understand that Russia's a poor country, but not like Ukraine. And there's a lot of people that go, we'd be better off if we were ruled by Russia than if we're ruled by the Ukrainian government. But I have no doubt the Ukrainian government, that's renowned for its corruption, just like the Russian government is, they don't want to lose their power because they have so much graft and they're making so much money off of it. So there's a mix of people in that country, and even that's hard to think about as to who's right. And I'm not sure we should rubber stamp and say just because the Ukrainian government is saying we're the government that they're inherently right.
So well, I mean, that raises an interesting question in terms of what defines the legitimate government.
So in the Crimean Peninsula, the Republic of Crimea, the Ukrainian government violated the constitution that joined the Republic of Crimea to the Ukraine. And so the Republic of Crimea said, you either reinstitute the constitution that we joined with you, or you are not our federal government. They refused to do it, and they said, you're under a new government. And then, whether the poll's accurate or not, it's almost certainly not, but 85-90% of the people in the Crimean Peninsula speak Russian. And they said, we'd rather be part of Russia. And so they signed bills saying, we'd rather be part of Russia. And so it wasn't like it was lawless. It was the Parliament of Crimea that the Ukrainian government was trying to abolish that said we want to become part of Russia. And my point, though, is that it gets to be really hard to say who the right people are here. I mean, really hard, because I don't know, should Ukraine continue to have it? I don't know nearly enough details to say it, but it is very shaky to say we're sure that Ukraine should have control over Crimea and not Russia.
And I think one of the, necessary caveat, in case no one has figured this out who's listened to the podcast before, is none of us know all that much about Ukraine. But one point is, how much does the U.S. government know about Ukraine? And what is their standard of right and wrong? I mean, these big secular countries, they don't care that much about the law. They don't care about what's right and wrong all that much as they do about their own interests, their own political power. It varies. I think some countries, the U.S. in certain ways, at certain times, tries to do things that are right more than certain other countries. In the eyes of the people who are in charge.
I think the right answer is in the eyes of the population. They try to do things that look morally good because they're trying to help their own power.
Right, but countries don't care about, is this their ally acting legally all that much? If it's popular, if it's going to accomplish their ends, they don't care. And so the fact that the U.S. government is telling us things, first of all, it's hard to necessarily even know what the mind of the people is in a country halfway around the world, as I think if you're watching foreign policy closely, or even not that closely, you recognize that the U.S. government thinks that people support things, and they invade them and find out, oh wait, we actually had no idea what the people thought. So can you even trust the government, even if they're acting in good faith and trying to tell you the truth? Can you trust the government?
And you look at like President Biden's polls right now. Some pollsters have him at 20 points underwater. Some have him at 3. That's a huge difference. We can't even figure out where the United States is in terms of public opinion. The idea that we can figure out, or that the government, where there's a lot more funding, there's a lot more organizations that have money that is spending money to try to figure out what the position of the American people are. It's really hard to know the position of the American people. The idea that we can know the position of the Ukrainian people, it's just not true.
But when you listen to the narrative, which is real, I mean, because we've talked about, like you said, we don't know, we have limited information. But even with just a little bit of looking, you can see the complexity of the situation. And then you listen, like, they were talking about whether they should bring Ukraine into NATO. And I think it was Josh Hawley goes, I don't know that we should bring him into NATO. And then Jen Psaki, her response back to him is first she goes, you are parroting Russian propaganda, which means Hawley's not even thinking. He's not thinking. He's just saying Russian propaganda, just reading it. He's just repeating what he's heard from Russia. And then she's like, America has this history of protecting other people's, independence and their democracy. And so she's acting like Ukraine, like these Ukrainian freedom fighters out, they're all sitting there united, huddled, going, protect us from Russia. And that's not the situation at all.
And I mean, the idea that you will bring Ukraine into NATO just because they're nice people, I mean, it has real meaning,
right?
Because there's real differences in how things are. It's a real difference for Ukraine to be a nation that, as far as I know, we have no treaty obligations to. We have no obligation to defend them if they get attacked. I mean, we're friends with them, whatever
right.
that means. But if they join NATO and it's confirmed by the Senate. So it's a commitment of the government that we're going to defend them, and that's actually something that you look at Scripture, and God takes that seriously.
Right.
You look in Joshua, and the Israelites are going into the land of Canaan, and they get these emissaries saying we're from a faraway country, and so they make a peace treaty with them. Well, turns out it was people deceiving the Gibeonites who were right there.
Right.
And then even hundreds of years later, Israel is judged because Saul oppressed the Gibeonites. And so, if your nation makes a commitment to another nation, that's something that God takes seriously. And so the idea that, we're going to just bring Ukraine as an ally, which is what joining NATO would mean, that we're obligated to defend them, that has real consequences. When a country is threatening to invade them and saying this area should be part of our country. And the thing is, too, does Russia want to go to war with the United States? No.
Right.
Does the U.S. want to go to war with Russia? No. But countries have gone to war before that didn't intend to go to war, but they went down a path and they got to a point where they couldn't turn back, and they were committed to war without even meaning to.
And part of the equation of that path that you're talking about, of not wanting to go down it but ending up where you didn't want, is you start spinning a narrative early in the story, and then all of a sudden you can't pull back. And if you don't believe that, I mean, just look at what's happened with COVID over the last year and a half, where you start telling these stories and then you realize, you can't pull this thing back. You can't rein this thing in because you've made commitments that you want people to believe. And if you change your behavior mid-course, you look really kind of stupid. And you realize people can go to war for exactly the same sorts of things.
When I was growing up and going to public school, it's like, rah, rah, America, we always do the right thing. We always do what's right and good and just.
That's what we said at private school, too.
Yeah, and then you come out and you start to study it. And a lot of the wars that we get into, they're not right. They're not just. We're doing it because it's politically expedient for the party in power. And, I remember when Monica Lewinsky is on the television station, being interviewed, and then all of a sudden Clinton must bomb Sudan right now. It's really important. There's this, and it was a pharmaceutical factory. It was totally fabricated because you use war if you're in the power and you have the ability to send in troops and to send missiles. You use that to drive stories off the front page that you don't want. And Reagan's done it. Bush did it. Clinton did it. Obama did it. They all do it.
Right.
And so for us to sit back, the American people need to not be naive. And it's not saying that Biden inherently is doing it, but at least we need to ask the question, because if you look at it, the buildup happened in November, but it didn't really start to get on the news until Biden said, as soon as the ground freezes, Russia's going to invade Ukraine. It was Biden that drove it to the front page,
right,
which makes me think it's likely much more political than it is, that the actual world's changing and the things are changing, because it's President Biden that's driving the story.
Right. And if it is changing, it may be changing because of what Biden's doing, as opposed to it changing on its own calculus and its own, working out on its own, which is he's interjected himself into something. And let's be honest, between Biden and Putin, which one do you think is better at manipulating? You know what I mean?
Biden's pretty good at it.
Biden's got a lot of power and he's good at manipulating America. I'm just saying,
the one who was a career in,
the KJB.
Exactly, that one.
KGB. It's the KJB.
KJB.
I only read the KJB. Or KJB only here.
I don't know, but you say he was in the KGB, but Biden was in the Senate. Is there that much difference?
We hope so.
Well, no, I think in terms of spinning stories and controlling people, it's actually the KGB would just kill people. If Biden actually had to be more experienced at actually manipulating people.
No, it's so easy. Honestly, it's so easy to go, he's a bumbling idiot when he's not a bumbling idiot. Let's just be really clear. He's savvy enough to get elected, and it's hard. It's hard to get people to follow you. It's hard to get them to do what you want them to do.
And
he's capable.
He did some, like when Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas. He manipulated the American people. He was good, and so we shouldn't dismiss his ability to manipulate people. He's very good at it. In an American setting, in a Russian setting, you manipulate people differently because they're looking for different things. They're looking for the strong man. They're looking for the tough guy that nobody won't back off.
Rides around on a horse shirtless.
Right. And that's not Biden.
Thank goodness.
and once you get to diplomacy, that's a different type of manipulation as well. There's all kinds of people who have been good at getting elected in their country and have not been good at diplomacy, and probably vice versa. It is not necessarily a one-to-one skilled comparison.
And just in general, and again, not talking, I do think Ukraine probably applies, but it may not. But one thing to recognize is that in domestic policy, there ends up being lots of sources of information. Even like when they're trying to, Fauci is the only one you're allowed to listen to. Facebook's trying to shut anybody down. All these other people are trying to shut other people down, but it still gets out. Ukraine, they're able to control the narrative. The sole source of the media tends to be the U.S. government in foreign policy, especially foreign policy in a place that's that remote, right? In the UK, you could get some. In France, you could get some. Germany. But if you start to get to some of these other countries, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Ukraine, it starts to be that there's a single source of information. So because there's a single source of information, if you have a disunified country, you can unify them because they're all kind of thinking the same thing because there's only one source of information. And so if you have the fragmentation, foreign policy is a good way to try to unite everybody back behind you, which is why I think so many presidents use it when they see that they're losing the American people. They use it because all of a sudden they get to be the one that's saying this is what the story is, and the news media is just reporting what they're being told largely. Or they're reporting, in Vietnam War, they were in with a unit and they could only do what the unit allowed them to do. And so it ends up that in those type of engagements, the U.S. government now has control over the press, where they clearly don't in domestic policy.
And I think one of the answers to that is that you need a government that's operating off of clear moral principles, clear objectives, and is not pragmatic, wishy-washy, doing whatever they think is going to accomplish their goals. Because if you're walking righteously and doing the right thing, then and you're at least have elected someone who you think is going to try to do that. But now we elect people who we don't have that much of a moral principles in diplomacy. I mean, the idea is kind of, anything goes in a way. And so, you're not even expecting people to act honestly. And so, you end up getting lied to. What do you expect? I mean, there's not this requirement of honesty in diplomacy.
I mean, and this kind of what you were talking about just a minute ago about foreign policy being an effective way to sort of manipulate people. It kind of goes back to your point about where I was saying between Biden and Putin, who's going to be better. But the truth is Biden doesn't care what Putin does.
Right.
It's a win-win scenario for him. You know what I mean? It's if Putin goes and he attacks, I told you there was a threat. I told you this was going to be an issue, and now I have justification to do other things that I want to do, or even just say maybe we have
everybody unites behind you.
Maybe we have to let it happen, but hey, I told you this is going to happen. Putin decides not to attack. Look, I was able to get in there by us moving, by us doing these things. We stopped it from happening, and so in the end, like you said, you switch the narrative so that you're the sole source of information, and regardless of the outcome, you're able to play it into a scenario where it's really advantageous for you.
And I think when you look at history, this is how you get into wars. Because you have Putin, he's got to be the tough guy, right? I mean, that's what Russia wants. That's what they're looking for. In my understanding of Russia, which is very limited, just to put that
the
caveat
man riding
there.
on a horseback or fighting
right,
bears.
I mean, there is
right?
enough, and he does, the black belt in judo and all this other stuff that he's doing.
Right.
It kind of testifies that that's what Russia's looking for.
Right.
And then you look at what America's looking for, and they're looking for, we're going to stand up for the little guy, right? Is kind of what the American
because we're
persona
we're the big guy.
We're the big guy, and so we look out for the little guy, and we're the nice people out there.
Right.
And so if you're that person and you're sending it over to appeal to the Americans, you send over troops into countries next to it. But then what does Putin have to do? Well, all of a sudden Putin looks and goes, well, this is where I may not have done anything. Now I have to show that I'm not weak because I need to win my populace. I can't lose my base of power. And this is how and I'm not saying it's going to happen in this case, but this is exactly how you do it because each president is playing to their power base. And so they're playing to build up their own local power. And sometimes the way you do it is in conflict with the other. So you end up ratcheting up. And then you get to the point where you can't turn away because both sides are ratcheting up.
Right. And you can see this. I mean, you can see it in everything from the playground, when you were in school, when one person does something and to be able to maintain their position, the other person has to do. You can see it you can see it at work where there's a power play between two people, and there's, and this is part of the issue is all of a sudden we act like there's this disconnect when it gets to government. Like we can't use the things that we think about in the world and in our lives to explain the government to ourselves. But the truth is people are people, and there are people everywhere, and you use the power you have to improve your position. A president is no different.
And I mean, and you look, right? I mean, just to give a really concrete example, I forget what the exact number was, but less than 10,000 troops Biden decided that he's going to deploy. Well, how many troops are already in Europe that are U.S. troops? It's a small fraction of NATO's forces that we just deployed over there. But yet deploying that is like a slap in the face to Putin.
Right.
When it couldn't have materially have changed very much the balance of power with us. But yet Biden sent them over there because this shows that he's doing something. He's taking this serious. He's going to protect Ukrainians. When the reality is it wasn't necessary. It was much more of a political move because there's lots of troops over there.
Right. And it is a news story, though. Anytime you send U.S. troops somewhere foreign for something other than just routine movements, it's a story.
So assume, for example, that Ukraine is a wholly sympathetic country that is about to be invaded by Russia, or likely possible, which is, the kind of the message is being put out, whether that's true or not. Why would it be wrong for the U.S. to send troops to an ally, even though it is a gesture, but gestures are meaningful? And if it did, cause them to back down, because there's a point where you can't appease forever. I mean, it's all well and good to say let's not ratchet things up, but there's a point where you do have to, speak softly and carry a big stick.
So I just checked, and there's 3.5 million NATO troops. in reserve, troops and in reserve in Europe. 3.5 million, and we just sent over less than 10,000. It didn't actually change the balance of power there at all.
And it wouldn't have
This was
anything
for the
more-
U.S.
Well,
This
if
wasn't
you
for over there.
If you just said, we'll defend Ukraine, you already had, you know what I mean? In other
And
words,
instead, he's saying, we're not going to defend you. We won't send troops into Ukraine. Then why do you send troops over there?
Right.
Especially when there's, I forget, there's like 60,000 troops in Germany already. It's easy enough to move 9,000 troops there, but that wouldn't drive the newspaper stories the same way. If you
Definitely
just
not in the
shit
U.S.
in the
No,
U.S.
But what? Right. But why is it? But there's the thing too is countries don't keep their commitments. You know, the fact that the U.S. had a treaty with Ukraine, but Putin was confident that they would break. He could easily be confident at a certain point that the U.S. would break their treaty and not defend them. Plenty of countries have broken their treaties. But to send the troops is to say we have a commitment to NATO and we're going to.
But my point is that NATO has plenty of troops. We have plenty of troops in Europe. Why not just shift some of those troops? It's because it wouldn't be the same story in the U.S. Putin would know that they were there. If the message was to Putin,
you said Putin would know.
he would know.
Right.
If the message was to Putin, you'd do something different. The message wasn't to Putin; it was to Americans. The one who seems to be the one that's most stirring the pot is President Biden, in my view. That's what it seems like he's doing, because there's ways he could do the same thing without stirring the pot the same way.
I mean, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that. I'm just saying it is at that point it is a judgment call.
Absolutely.
I mean, in terms of, you know, if you're saying it's okay to have the troops over there, then it's a judgment call as to whether it's going to be effective to add more troops or not. And I mean, you know, there could be arguments on either side, and one is probably right. But
Well, I mean, one of the things that also happened last month was that North Korea shot off more missile tests than they ever have before. When that happened, when President Trump was in office, that became this, we're all going to die. North Korea is going to conquer the United States. You have to do something. Trump's incompetent, so everybody's going to die. And now they do a lot more than they did under President Trump, and you don't hear anything from the media. I mean, I think it's really important for Americans to recognize how manipulated we are by the media, because, I mean, the media says this is an important story, and we all go, yes. And then the same thing happens even more, and we all go, oh, it doesn't matter because the media didn't tell us to care.
I mean, part of it is I think we even forget what media is. Media is a means you use to communicate. And there's this part of it where what we think of is we think what the media tells us it is, which is also purposeful, is it tells us we're this thing that goes out and finds the truth and brings it to you, which is, I mean, you know, and you really have to train your brain to go, no, you're not. No, you are not. You are a means for someone who owns the newspaper, who owns the, what's a newspaper? So you're the means by which someone who owns a news
YouTube
a
channel,
news corporation, a news empire, to communicate to people about what they think is important. That's what the media and the government uses it, but in the end, I mean, that is what it's for. It's for them. I mean, when you go back to where, like, you know, newspapers were first founded and you read their charter, the purpose of them was we want to get Democrats elected or we want to get Republicans elected. No bones about it. That was what they were created for. And even then, they would sit back and they would tell this fantasy story about what they were really doing, even though their charter explicitly said this. But we've bought this idea. We've bought this idea that their job is fundamentally a news fact-finding organization, and that is not what they are for. They are for communicating what they want to people.
And there is the other side, right? Because they communicate what will cause people to look at it, right? Because
right. You have to get eyeballs.
Also, you are trying to get eyeballs. It is a business that you're
Yes.
trying to make money. So there is this, we want to communicate the message we want to communicate, but we want to communicate those aspects of it that will attract people to, you know, frequent our advertisers or
right.
pay to be subscribed or X, Y, and Z. But there is a monetary aspect to it as well. It's not just that they're feeding us what they want to feed us.
And when you think about the president, like you're talking about, he sends over 10,000 troops. There's this part of it where Joe Biden knows. I mean, so I grew up Republican. I grew up in a Republican household. I grew up in a Republican church. If I hear that a president sent troops over somewhere to fight Russia, there is still just in my brain, there is a part of me that goes, good job, Joe. I mean, and I can't even stop myself from doing it. You know what I mean? I grew up with the Cold War, with Red Dawn. I watched the Alvin and the Chipmunks special about where the wall fell in Germany. You know what I mean? I mean, this is the level.
Alvin and the Chipmunks?
Alvin and the Chipmunks. They sing a song and the wall comes down with power of music. You know what I mean? And Joe Biden knows that there's a percentage of the population that if you send troops over against Russia, their brain is hardwired to go, you know, little echoes of Ronald Reagan in you, man. You're gonna, you know what I mean? And so but just by doing it, he knows if they just say what he did, he will have communicated a very specific thing to a part of the country that he's underwater with right now.
Right, especially that's what I was going to say. Is it's especially targeting with a specific group, which the blue collar workers and stuff are much more likely to go, yeah, good job, Joe.
Right. I mean, even they might go, I hate everything else, but hey, at least you're able to do that.
At least you stood up to Russia.
Right. You know what I mean? And so, I mean, it's just. This is what the media is the media is Joe Biden's chalkboard, and he's just writing a message to the American people on it through the media going, here's something I did that I think you'll want to know about, that you'll like about me. And so this is, you know what I mean? And I think that's how you
don't have to have
back.
competing voices, which is
right.
Which is great, right? If you're trying to get people to follow your line of thought,
right.
Foreign policy is a good place to do it.
Yes. And I think, and like I said, I have to step back and go, wait a minute, am I being manipulated? Whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's a conservative, I have to step back and go, why did they do this?
And it's especially, for a certain group that is turning against Biden, it's rah, we're Americans.
Right.
Right. And so when you say going up against Russians, it's rah, we're Americans.
Yeah.
And that kicks in, and I think, it's likely to improve his ratings.
I mean, part of this equation that we've sort of danced around is when the media is communicating with you, they're not just giving you information. They are trying to tell you what you should care about. And that's the point at which you are most vulnerable to manipulation. Is it would be really nice if somebody else would tell me what's really important, because there's so much stuff that I could be investing my time and my energy and my resources in. And if somebody would just tell me, oh, Russia, Ukraine, big deal.
Right.
Then I don't have to do the work of saying, hey, is that more important for me to spend time on than what's happening in North Korea? Or for that matter, is that more important than the problems I'm having with my wife and kids? Because I can spend a whole lot of time, and I can feel really good about spending a lot of time trying to figure out Russia and Ukraine, when it may not actually be what God wants me spending any of my attention on.
Right, because of the limited effect and impact you can actually have on it.
And that's not an argument for Christians to disengage. It's not an argument for Christians to not know what's going on in the world or not care about what's going on in the world. It's just saying, realize what the media is trying to do is they want you to care about certain things. They want you, and sometimes those things are worth caring about. Sometimes they're just total distractions. Sometimes they're just total garbage. I mean, who cares what celebrity did what thing anymore? But you do. And the reason you do is because you've been manipulated for your entire life by a media who says, hey, this is an effective way to get viewers and distract them.
And it is important to recognize that there's like a tug of war here, right? Because on the one hand, the media is trying to pull you where it wants to go. But on the other hand, if people start to go, we really want to know about this, they could drag the media. And so you get these things where the media says, forget it. We shouldn't even consider that it was done in the lab in Wuhan. That's not a chance. That's off the table. Forget it. Nobody needs to even think about that. And then people started to think about it and started to question, and they started to look at emails, and they started to go, wait a second. And then all of a sudden the media was pulled. So we have to recognize that there is this pulling back and forth that happened. And that happens with the government too, is that a president might want to drive the country to focus on one thing, but if the country starts focusing on something else, it has real weight, and the president has to respond. And so there's this constant tug of war, which is kind of how God puts checks and balances in the world, is that just because you're an authority, it doesn't mean that you can do all kinds of things, because even, President Putin of Russia if he loses his base, he will stop being president, regardless of how many elections he tries to manipulate. If most people are against him in Russia, you can't maintain power.
And it's kind of like we talk about the power of the media, but like you look at Joe Rogan, he gets paid a whole bunch of money by Spotify, and there's people out there trying to shut him down on Spotify. And then Rumble comes out and says, we'll offer you $100 million to come to our platform and come over here. And there's this part of it where so Joe Rogan's this not that conservative guy at all, this fairly liberal guy. But the reason
Bernie Sanders supporter.
But he's pulling things because he's saying, I want to sit down and have engaged conversations. And the media is going, we don't want to do that. We want to give you the information. But this idea of someone saying, I want to have these engaging conversations is so powerful that there are people offering $100 million to him to just have him talk on their platform and have conversations with people. And that's kind of what you're saying is, in a sense, there are people out there going, this is what we want. Do you understand? We want this. And the media is going, we don't want to play, and they haven't decided that they have to play yet. But at some point, they're going to.
Right, or old media will just disappear, which is essentially what's happening, right? Is that a lot of these news organizations that think they can control everything, I mean, the number of subscribers and stuff is dropping rapidly. The number of people that watch nightly news is dropping rapidly. And one thing with all this that I think is really worth noting is I remember when I was a kid, you basically had only, 3, ABC, NBC, CBS, and maybe about 4 newspapers or 5 newspapers that were considered significant. And they basically, that was your news. And yeah, there were other newspapers, but they were usually associated with one of the other newspapers, and they were still getting it either from Reuters or from AP. And so basically, there weren't all these other voices because the ability to communicate. And so even now you look at it and you go, well, look at how bad it is that the media can manipulate people. It's nothing like it was 50 years ago, like nothing, because there is YouTube. And even as they try to squelch it, then another one comes up and another one. In the world and the technology in the world is such that this ability to manipulate people is decaying. It's not nearly where it was 50 years ago, where nobody even knew what war was like until Vietnam War, where they started to film it and bring it back because nobody had anything, and the reporters could only report what they were told, and it was always reported on the stations that all were, there was a certain liberal line that they've been marching on for 60 or 70 years. I
want to dampen your enthusiasm there a little bit, which doesn't usually happen, but
it's rain cloud, Jonathan.
You say the ability to manipulate people is diminishing, and you're right. The ability to manipulate people by those old means of having just very few sources is diminishing. But what's not diminishing at all is
the gullibility of
people. The gullibility of people, the desire to be manipulated, the desire to be told. And so, if those particular sources are no longer capable of doing that, somebody else is going to come in and fill in that void.
And part of what I was saying is, though, that now there's some people that are getting manipulated by Fox News, and there's some that are getting manipulated by New York Times. And so you have different groups being manipulated, which is one of the reasons that they keep talking about the fragmentation of the country. Well, it didn't used to be that fragmented because there was only one source of information that they were basically all saying the same thing. So there was unity because yes, people still want to be manipulated, but there wasn't the fragmentation of manipulation that there is now. And the real problem is people should want to take every thought captive, right? Because if they're taking every thought captive to Christ, then you don't get manipulated the same way.
So Isaiah 57:11, and of whom have you been afraid or feared that you have lied and not remembered me, nor taken it to your heart? Is it not because I have held my peace from old that you do not fear me? And so there's this part of it where God's saying, when you lie because you don't fear God. And so there's this part of it where the reason why the government lies so much and the reason why we're manipulated so much is because we don't fear God. And when you don't fear God, what you do is you say, someone else has to take care of these things. And when you do that, you depend on the machinations of men. You know what I mean? And so there's this part of it where if you're in government and you don't fear God, you go, I'm the thing standing between people and evil. Me and my stratagems, I'm in project management at work, and there are times where I'm really tempted to think that my stratagems are what's going to help us. You know what I mean? You're sitting there laughing, going, "Oh," and it's stupid. But once you lose the fear of God, that's all you have left are the efforts of men. And you put your faith in the efforts of men. And so when these people who lie, the reason they're lying is because we as a people have put our hopes in them. And so, you can look and see, like with the increase of lying, and it has a lot to do with when people started looking to government as their salvation. This is when the lying of government increased. This is when the manipulation by these things. And so, and like what you're saying is, in a sense, this is why I wanted to say it, is because they both tie together. Is even though the means by which they use them are being thwarted by changes in technology and changes in capability, it won't change completely because we want to be manipulated because we don't trust God. And so what we're saying is save us from these things. And one of the ways they save us is they're like, we're going to take away the fear by telling you a lie. Because how else can we take away the fear? The truth doesn't make you happy. The truth makes you scared. So we're not going to tell you the truth. And so, I think as we're talking about these things, this is what's going on, is because even the things like, even their desire to attempt to do these things is caused by their knowledge that people don't fear God and their own participation in that lack of fear of God. And what tamps it down, what makes them go silent, is people just trusting in God. People learning to trust in God. And so, I think, like I said, I think there's going to be examples of this as we go through and we talk about the government, but that should just be in the back of our mind, is it's the fear of God that really drives all these things. It's the fear of God that drives both sides. And you can't look at the government going, you can't trust the government because the government just always lies. The government does what the people want it to do usually. That's most of the time what they're doing.
And I do think when you get to the fear of God, there's some really basic things, right? How do you determine if something's true? Because we've been sitting here going, what's really happening in the Ukraine? And the answer is, we don't know. Well, How do you determine if something's true? If you fear God, God tells you how.
Right.
It's by 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact is established.
Right.
And so when all we're hearing is from the government, we're not supposed to take that as true. It may be true, but the facts aren't established, but yet we'll take that as true because we're not fearing God.
Right.
We're saying, well, they could invade Ukraine and then they could take over Europe. And we just have to believe that, as opposed to going, no, let's fear God and say facts are established with 2 or 3 witnesses.
And even to pull back, even broader scale, thinking about, how the fear of God instead of fear of the world comes into play in situations like this, is when you understand that God is the one in control. It gives you the peace that no matter what's raging, maybe we can sit here and say, well, logically Americans don't need to care about Ukraine or shouldn't care about Ukraine. But, whatever's happening, if you're in the middle of that situation, you don't need to fear.
Right.
Not because there aren't real physical threats to you, but because God is in control, and that's the only hope, is to trust in God and that He has a plan, and that the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing, but God can frustrate that. He changed the hearts of kings like a watercourse. And so no matter what you're headed into, as a Christian, you can remain confident.
Right.
But that's also why the wicked don't have peace, right? Because they can't say that, because they've rejected that God. And so they can't say we can have peace in the midst of these circumstances, which is one of the reasons that the country the media can manipulate people, is because they don't have peace. They're going, oh no, what will happen? Will Europe fall? And if Europe falls, then the next thing we know, we're back in the Cold War.
Yeah, and there's people that need to make real decisions with the information in front of them, but the gospel should free you from worry about things you don't have any control over. And if you're not in the government, your effect on diplomacy is rather limited, especially if it's not involving the country you're in, and so you don't need to worry about it for the vast majority of your waking hours.
Right now, there is difference between strategy and tactics, right? You don't need to worry about tactics, but we do have a responsibility to say, is this what our government should be doing? And the people, just like there's this tug of war between the media and the people, there's a tug of war between the media or the people and government too. And the people can stop the government from doing things. And we should recognize that we do have some responsibility there, not to know all the details, because tactically, how can we get involved? But strategically, the people, they are our elected representatives, and they are driving in a specific direction that we have responsibility for. We bear that. We'll bear the guilt if it's unrighteous.
And if as a people we actually say we hate lies, it changes. You know what I mean? If a politician knows that the people won't put up with lies, their behavior changes, because they know if they lie, they lose. You know what I mean? They have to do things that they can then come to you and tell you about, because otherwise, you know what I mean? And so it just changes everything. If they expect me to do this and lie about it, and that's what they want, that's what you get. That's all you get. And everything becomes tactics.
And that's one of the things that happened recently related to this, is that, State Department spokesman gets out there and starts to say, here's what's happening, here's what Russia's doing. And an AP reporter went, but you lie to us all the time. Why would I believe you? And it was pretty shocking, because most of the time they just kind of absorb it. And instead he went, no, what's your evidence?
Russia continues to engage in disinformation
campaigns.
campaigns.
You made an allegation that they might do that. Have they actually done it?
We told you a few weeks ago that we have information indicating Russia also has already prepositioned a group of operatives to conduct a false flag operation in eastern Ukraine. So that, Matt, to your question, is an action that Russia has already taken.
It's an action that you say that they have taken, but you have shown no evidence to confirm that. And I'm going to get to the next question here, which is, what is the evidence that they... this is like crisis actors, really? This is like Alex Jones territory you're getting into now. What evidence do you have to support the idea that there is some propaganda film in the making?
Matt, this is derived from information known to the U.S. government, intelligence information that we have declassified. I think you know...
Okay, well, where is it? Where is this information?
It is intelligence information that we have declassified.
Well, where is it? Where's the declassified information?
I just delivered it.
No, you made a series of allegations and statements.
Would you like us to print out the topper? Because you will see a transcript of this briefing that you can print out for yourself.
That's not evidence, Ned. That's you saying it. That's not evidence. I'm sorry.
You have been doing this for quite a while. You know that when we declassify intelligence information,
right. And I
we do so in a means. We do so with an eye to protecting sources and methods.
Is not going to fall. I remember a lot of things. So where is the declassified information other than you coming out here and saying?
Matt, I'm sorry you don't like the format, but we have declassified.
It's not the format; it's the content.
I'm sorry you don't like the content. I'm sorry you are doubting the information that is in the possession of the U.S. government.
What is the evidence that you have that suggests that the Russians are even planning this?
Matt,
I'm not saying that they're not, but you just come out and say this and expect us just to believe it without you showing a shred of evidence that it's actually true. Other than when I ask, or when anyone else asks, what's the information? You said, well, I just gave it to you, which was just you making a statement.
Matt, if you doubt the credibility of the U.S. government, of the British government, of other governments, and want to, find solace in information that the Russians are putting out, that is for you to do.
I think in our country would be a lot healthier if there were a lot more people that would push back, like that AP reporter did, and not just say, if you're in the government, you tell the truth. Because the children of Satan are liars. This is what the Bible says. You do the works of your father, and your father is a liar. And so, it's very interesting that he was pushing back, but that's really unusual. And they have ways to punish you if you do, that they don't call on you, et cetera, et cetera. But, it's and
they tried to shame
that's what
him.
they need more, and they tried to shame him.
I mean, if you want to doubt the U.S. government and the UK government, and your immediate response is, "Are you kidding? Of course we doubt the U.S. government." But then he
even listened
and finds solace in what the Russian government is saying, as if you don't believe us, it must mean you're believing them. And it's like, no, I can think you're all liars. I mean, that's actually a really easy position to
Equal
hold.
opportunity on that one.
Right. I mean, but and it is, you're just sitting there listening to it going, yeah, this is clearly someone who's never had anyone question them.
Right. And just thinking about it a little bit, you have them blowing up the so-called terrorists. It was a family that was, doing aid work in Kabul. You have, the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. You have the genocide in Bosnia where, people still think there was a genocide in Bosnia and they never found any bodies.
Hey, the government never declassifies information unless they are very confident in it. And he said that with a straight face.
I know. And the weapon, and the reporter even said, what about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? And it doesn't change him. I mean, he just goes, of course you have to believe us. And the pharmaceutical factory in Sudan, I mean, repeatedly they tell lies for political gain. And it's not like the Democrats do this and the Republicans don't. Let's be serious. Both sides do this for political gain. And then they turn around and say, believe us. And the answer should be, you keep lying to us. You have to prove it. We're not just going to accept it.
The reason why they're so successful in lying is because we want them to lie. There are scenarios where we don't want them to lie. We don't want them to lie to us, but we want them to lie to us about other things. We want them to lie and say, this is going to be fine. We want them to lie and say, we're going to take care of these things. We want to be comforted with their lies, and you can't pick and choose. You either have to love the truth or you have to love lies. And you don't get to just switch back and forth between them. And if you do, you'll get this. This is how we've arrived at this place.
And what happens is that you want to join with other people in saying that a lie is true.
Right.
And so what happens is you can get waves of the public opinion doing big shifts, because then all of a sudden everybody goes, wait a second, I want to believe this is true now, regardless of the basis of whether it's true or not. And so you get people shifting. So people will watch that and they'll go, oh yeah, I trust the AP reporter and I don't trust him. And they'll create a following, just like with the COVID stuff, where it's not people looking for the truth. They're looking for success on their side so that they can join with a group of people that all say, this is what we're going to say is true. So one of the things that we look at with what's happening in the Ukraine is we should expect this to happen more, because there's things happening in the world that are just being reflected in Ukraine. For instance, a lot of World War II, Hitler's initial things were, well, I want to regain the German people to be part of Germany. And that's essentially what Putin's saying. When he took over the Crimean Peninsula, he's saying, these are Russian people who want to be Russian. They speak Russian. And so they want to be Russian. They don't want to be part of Ukraine. So we're just taking back our people. And one of the things that happens is that there was stability in countries because of religion, because religion can create stability across racial lines. But as you have a breakdown of religion, the obvious groups that people break into are based on language, right? I mean, that's the Tower of Babel. Genesis 11:6 and 7, and the Lord said, indeed, the people are one and they all have one language. And this is what they begin to do. Now, nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. And so if you don't have the unifying aspect of religion, then what you end up breaking down to, the natural break that God put into the world, was language. And so if you're in, and I think I have a chart here that shows the different provinces in Ukraine. And if you look, like Crimea is 80% Russian speaking. There's another one that's over 95% Russian speaking. Well, these people can't even speak to their government because they don't speak the language. And so for them, because there's not, what's the unifying factor for Ukraine? Well, there really isn't any. It's just an exercise of power. And so for them, a lot of those people, they'd rather be Russian, which is part of the problem.
Right.
And some may not. They may speak Russian but want to be Ukraine, but the natural break is language. And so some of these things that are shaking out, they're shaking out because of language differences, because where national borders were drawn were not where the natural break is. But what heals that natural break is the gospel. What heals that natural break that can cause religions to be cause languages to be overcome is religion. I mean, more generally than Christianity. Christianity is the one that really solves it, but even you can paper over it by having agreements on false religions. But if you start to break down and become an a-religious society, like all of Europe is becoming, we should expect more wars like this.
And this is something that you even see happening in the U.S., where, I mean, on the one side, you have elements in the country that are pushing the division to say we need to be looking at people through racial lines, through, gender identity lines and all these different things to say, let's not be unified, but let's only get our whatever unity we might have by dividing the different groups and pitting each other against each other. And then, you have, on the other hand, historically, you have, white supremacy, whatever the more historical term for that would be, where they are trying to suppress, black people. And then you have different flavors of it today where people are saying that America has a certain identity that is, for some people, is connected with, certain cultural or even racial elements, absent any biblical principles or perhaps any principles that are that firmly held at all. And so you have the same thing where these same things are happening in America, where you have people talking about, saying that Texas and New Mexico need to break away from the United States for ethnic reasons to create a Mexican-American ethnic state. And these are things that in America today aren't causing bloodshed, at least not widespread. But in other countries, like even Ukraine, there are civil wars, rebellions, whatever you want to call them, depending on which side you're on, where groups of people are saying we need to be part of Russia. Nations all over the world, this is happening, where it's coming down to ethnic issues. And the problem is it's impossible to sort out, because once you divide one ethnic group away, well, now what about the people that are still left from the other? How about the Ukrainians that are in the areas that got annexed to Russia? Now you have a big issue where Ukraine says we need to get this land back because you're oppressing the Ukrainians. And so it's an unsolvable problem if that's the way that you're approaching it.
And it seems to me that, again, in my lifetime, I've seen a huge shift in America where, it used to be if anybody came here, the expectation was that they would learn English. And then about, 40 years ago, there was a big shift that says you don't need to learn English. You can just keep your language. And we forget this is how you get nations to divide. This isn't like a minor thing. It's if you don't speak the same language, it's very difficult to have unity. And as we try to bring in more and more people that speak different languages, especially Spanish, you're going to get two countries because language is one of the primary ways. I would argue that language and religion are the two primary ways that you get a uniformity of culture. And so if you create two languages and you minimize religion, we should expect this to happen in America. We shouldn't think that this is just going to happen in Ukraine. We should see these same patterns and say these could happen in America very easily. And you see it already. Another thing that we should look at when we're considering this is, in Ukraine, they have the lowest birth rate in Europe. And that is also what's playing into this. When in 20 years, they expect the population of Ukraine to be half of what it is now. And this is happening all over the world. Greece isn't that far behind. Italy isn't that far behind. But they are the lowest birth rate in the world. I think it's 1.23 children per woman. And you have no immigrants because Ukraine's poor. And so what do you do? And the United States needs to start thinking about this because there's countries that are disappearing. So if Russia wants them and they're a country that's largely disappearing, at what point do you say, why should we prop up a country that every 20 years is having its population or every 30 years is having its population? Right now, the Ukrainians, 40% of the people that are of working age in Ukraine do not live in Ukraine and have no intention to return. They try to go to school other places in the EU, get jobs in the EU. And so there's more people in Ukraine over the age of 65 than are between the ages of 20 and 65. This is not a sustainable country. Russia may not do it now, but at some point, something's got to give. And
Right.
this isn't just this country. This is countries all over the world. This is Japan. This is, I mean, it's Italy. It's Greece. It's, it's all over the world. And, and these countries aren't wealthy enough that they get a whole bunch of immigrants like the United States does because, we're 1.7 or 1.8, something like that. So we're still would be declining except for the fact that we have immigrants. But this is a problem that we're going to have to face as a country. If we're going to get involved in every one of these, there's going to be a lot more.
I mean, and effectively what you're kind of saying here in a sense is you have to think about these things. And that's part of what we really wanted to kind of emphasize here is you can't just go us good, them bad, Russia bad, Ukraine good, must defend. If that's your foreign policy, you're going to be led around by the nose constantly. You're going to be manipulated and played with. And so you kind of have to, like that reporter who kind of kept asking questions going, but what is what you're telling me?
That's not
mean?
evidence.
Right. I mean, it's just right. I mean, you have to kind of go, you're not really giving me
You don't know
reasons.
what a deterrence is. I mean, it's like you see all the classic, fake arguments.
And if he had just come out and said, hey, we think they're going to do this. We want to say they're going to do this because if they do it, saying that they're going to do it could be an effective thing. That would be very, very different than you could tell he was saying we did it and we've declassified this info. Well, what did you declassify? What I just told you. This is, you've got to think about these things.
The really easy way to come at it is say, oh, there's a world conflict. I need to figure out who the good guy is and who the bad guy is. Because, we all grew up with the Lone Ranger. And we all think black hat, white hat sort of. And in this scenario.
Russia, U.S., right?
Right. And so you come out and you think, well, I have to find who the good guy is. I have to find who the bad guy is. And maybe it doesn't break down that way. Maybe you are watching a brawl in a back alley between a few Eastern European nations who haven't gotten over their communism.
Right.
And neither one of them has gotten over their atheism. And so they're going to fight. They're going to have a conflict because the only measures at which they can find unity or disunity are on economics, on language, on ethnicity, on things that God says are worldly. And you're just watching a worldly conflict and you want to say, all right, let's jump in. Right. Let's join that. Let's take that dog by the ears. And instead of sitting back and saying, well, hang on a second, are there real issues here of justice that are at play? If there are, okay, then maybe we do something. But we haven't talked about it that way because we want to think good and bad instead of saying, how is God judging this?
Because the U.S. uses rhetoric of justice, but there's a lot more motivation that is driven by power and influence rather than actual justice. And
because and I don't know how you could get away from this unless you're really self-conscious about your patriotism. But we've all grown up with the idea that America is good and always does what is right. And you've got to be willing to say, maybe not. And that there's no guarantee that if in the past we actually did that our actions in this case would necessarily be right.
When you were listing before, you listed like language and ethnicity and culture. Hey, another one that really unifies is power. The reason the U.S. wants to go, we're going to solve this is we're going to show we're the powerful country because we're Americans and that unifies America. And so there is that also. And it's very worldly. Like you said, it's as worldly as language. It's as worldly as any of the other one. But pride is a unifying thing. And so we want to go, we're the world superpower, so we're going to solve the problem. And maybe we should just step back and go, it's not our problem to solve.
Yeah, you could say China's a very unified nation because they have to be.
Right.
But not for good reasons.
Yeah, and if you really want to think through a situation like this, you have to realize that America is not the chosen people of God. And so, what if you're in Russia? What's your perspective? You have America, which is a huge, powerful country, who is will not rule out making an alliance with this corrupt, divided neighbor of yours that a lot of people in your country think you should control. And America, is threatening and actually hurting you economically, and your country feels like it needs to flex its muscles to show we can defend ourselves, all these different things. We want to have some influence over ourselves and keep space between us and these hostile forces. It's a different perspective, and not that Russia is right, but you have to weigh both of
perspective
them.
might be as legitimate as our
Right.
perspective. I mean, if you're sitting there and you're Putin, and you have this swath of Ukraine that is more than 80% Russian speaking, and you have Biden saber rattling, and there's no question that he's saber rattling, that he's going, they're going to invade, and we're going to destroy you with sanctions and all this other stuff, and you can't go any further. If you're Putin, the Russian people are going to start thinking, well, they're moving troops in. They're going to move in troops to where our people are. Even though they're in Ukraine, you can bet, just like when they put up the wall in Germany, where there were people in the east and the west that were similar families, when you have the Russians there, that some are in Ukraine and some are right across the border that are families and everything else, there's going to be pressure on Putin to take the territory now before it comes, because that would be the normal thing. You're saying my family is going to be invaded by these troops from America, and we forget to have that perspective. And we should have the perspective that everybody has their own perspective of how do they defend their families, their extended families, the people that they consider to be part of their ethnicity or part of their language, and they'll rise up and defend that, because for the reasons of power, for the reasons of prestige, for the reason of just feeling a camaraderie with them. And this is how you get into these places where you have both sides that keep ratcheting up, because people aren't willing to look at it and say, you know what, Russia may have a point here. In the U.S., I'm not saying the U.S. doesn't have a point, but Russia may have a point as well.
Right. But the point is that the U.S. can't with a straight face sit in a position of moral superiority over everyone else and say we are judging things by God's standard of right and wrong, because that's not the reality of history, and so we can't expect that's not how we've been operating. So even if we started today, we have to recognize that that's not the reputation that we have.
When we talk about Ukraine, it's really important for Christians to remember Micah 6:8. Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly before your God. And we have to recognize that our country is not a Christian nation, meaning that the people and the perspective of the country is Christian. And when the country says we're doing justly, Christians have an obligation to say, is it what God says is justly? Is it what God says is merciful? Is it what God says is walking humbly? And we need to start holding our political figures, the people that we elect, to a higher standard than just saying, I've said it, so you have to believe it, and start to go back to God's rules. And if Christians all would band together and do this, we could become a more just nation. Thanks for joining us.
This has been The Conquering Truth, a project of Reformation Baptist Church. If you found this helpful, you can visit us online at theconqueringtruth.com and subscribe here or in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for watching.